All right, all right, all right. I've been talking to Texas recently, so I'm using that. Welcome, Andy, to the Leaders Who Care series. It is really great having you here.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good to be here.
I am sure that you are going to prove and show, now that you have to, that you are a leader who cares, and then everything's going to be amplified from there. So, why don't we start in the normal way? If you could briefly introduce yourself, and this is something I have to emphasize to guys more than women, not what you do to start with, but who you are, like where are you from originally, where are you now, your family, things like that, and maybe something you've never told anybody ever, you want to reveal to the world now. That's always an interesting facet. You don't have to, but that's that. So tell us about Andy.
Yeah, I have to think about that last one. So I'm from a small town in Missouri, Fulton, Missouri, and it was a really lovely place to grow up. I grew up in the 80s, and I don't know. It feels like, well, obviously a different time to grow up. For me, I was a free range kid. I ran around a lot. I played. I was also really into computers and music. So I had a pretty geeky upbringing. I think I'm a geek by nature, and thankfully that's I think become sort of cool over time as technology has become, a profession that has led to so many beautiful things. And I know we'll talk more about that later. But one of those was I remember playing with an Apple IIc that we had in the first grade and actually playing around with Eliza, which was one of the first AIs, and then playing with digital music in the 80s, when it was so early. So I think I was exposed to a lot of this technology. Um, I'm very close with my family. My parents were both teachers, and kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. My dad was a philosophy professor. He passed about 3 months ago, so it's been a journey of my rite of passage, right, to live through that, and we've had a lot of space to grieve as a family. We're still very close. We all live close to each other now in the Chicago area in the United States, and I have one older brother, and growing up, I mean, gosh, like my dad's a philosophy professor. My mom taught elementary school
Hmm.
and was a specialist in early childhood and also wrote children's books. So, you know,
Right.
just this incredibly robust appreciation for art and education and trying everything. And they had summers off, that as teachers. And I never, of course, like a lot of things as a kid you take for granted. Oh my gosh, like the ability to travel and take, month-long road trips and go camping and go hiking. And, my dad was an Eagle Scout, so we had plenty of that. Lots of huge, deep appreciation for nature, which I'm incredibly grateful for.
I
And
love that. I remember the teachers having the summer off, and we had summer vacation, and it just seemed like we all weren't, when we were kids, mind you, but we all weren't stressed and moving all the time, like rushing and everything, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so it's like hard to even remember or think about now that I'm, a
Yeah.
working stiff, like so many, and even teachers now, I don't know that I think the pay has gotten so bad. I don't know that teachers can really take the summers off all the time either. But it's just glorious. And now, now I did get married 2 years ago. And so that was a huge blessing in my life. And I have a stepdaughter and
A
yeah, kind of having to,
bonus daughter. You should call her a
a
bonus
bonus daughter.
daughter.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much. Uh, but having to balance, like as so many parents, just how do I how do I how do I get my work done, which is important to me, and then of course how do I get the more important thing, uh, time for, which is time with my family.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. It's even mixed families are a lot different now. You got all that going on, as you said, and um, I do love the bonus daughter. My Danish bonus daughter told me that, and rather than step, it's a way better term to use. And but I'm so glad you brought that up because I remember those days. And my grade six teacher was like next door to me, and she would have the summers off too, and enjoying it, and we'd talk and stuff like that. And as it just seemed, and maybe as kids were romanticizing it a little bit, but it just did seem without all the technology, which has been really positive for so many reasons. However, without it, we were outside, we were doing more stuff. It seemed so it's a different world. But and there's pros and cons. Were you involved in sports, music, other stuff as well?
Way more music. Like I said, my parents really wanted us to try everything, and we did. In a box somewhere, I think I have like a second place tennis trophy that I think that was the peak of my sports career. And it was probably one of those like, somebody there were only two players or something. I don't know what it was, but uh, was never the great gift. But thankfully, I did inherit some other gifts. So I played piano, I played drums. I was one of, I think, only two kids I knew growing up who really stuck with piano. I feel like a lot of kids, if they have the advantage, maybe start with piano lessons, maybe play for a year or two, and then move on to something else.
Right,
Uh, but I stuck with it. I played, took piano lessons, played formally, classically trained for 10 years. And then along the way, I started playing drums and percussion. And uh, it's funny. The drums always became much more naturally to me, and then later playing in rock bands. I mean, that's where I feel like I can just totally let loose and just free range, music and improvise. Piano, maybe because I was classically trained, feels a little more boxed in and harder, right? In a lot of
right.
ways. But eventually, yeah, it's also kind of speaks to the idea of mindset. I think at some point I just was like, yeah, music is more than the notes on the page and it doesn't have to be that complex. I mean, some of the best music is incredibly simple, right? Just a couple chords. And so at some point I did start to play around more with improvising on the piano and I was like, "Oh, I can do this." It's like I have the technique, it's just the mindset of saying, "Yeah, let me play around more."
When you say simple, it reminds me of a song that got the Beatles famous, and it was about "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah."
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know.
So go figure. And they became famous on that, and the rest is history. What do you think you were envisioning back then as to what's going to happen?
Well, there was one clue. So I mentioned we had a computer in the house early on, and it was kind of I think the way computing was back then, this was pre-internet, right? This was in the 80s, and the computers were not really capable of a lot. They didn't have a lot of graphics capabilities and whatnot. So you tended to have the games were puzzle-based games, right? So
Hmm.
even the games on the computer really made you think and made you sort of figure things out. And there's this funny story in the second grade. My first grade teacher came and got me out of the classroom to come help her with her computer. So this was like really my first consulting experience. And she had an Apple IIe, and I walk in, and back then there was big clunkers, right? And you had to flip on the CPU, and you also had to turn on the monitor. So she just didn't have the monitor turned on. So I walk in, I flip the switch, I say, "Look, I cut you a deal. That'll be two cookies and a glass of milk. Call me next week if you have any more problems." And it's just funny. I don't know. Me, a second grader, more than any other adult apparently in the building, actually to help her figure out her computer.
Hey, listen, how many kids were asked by their grandparents why the VHR is flashing 12, 12, 12 all the time?
Oh, I was that kid. Every time we visit, my grandparents were all in Kansas, and every single time if the daylight, when daylight savings came, they'd be off again. But every time we visited, I'd set them straight.
Becomes for a good comedian skit, I guess. Well, can you share then some of your work experiences in your journey? There's a lot of really cool ones, but what you learned from virtuosities, for example, and then Go Human, some really interesting arenas you were working in. What experiences did you learn? And then that went on when you did advisory about, I think before Simon Sinek, about the whys, if you will, like, why and storytelling being so important for executives and entrepreneurs. Can you share a little bit about that journey and some experiences you learned from?
Yeah, gosh, Mark, those are deep cuts. So it's kind of fun to roll back the clock that far. Uh, kind of in parallel to a lot of that was Aztec, which was my first and most robust company. So I'll sort of tell those stories in parallel.
Yeah, please.
But Virtuosities, if you go back that far, that was my first gig out of college. It was a little web design company just north of Chicago. And I learned a lot, working there. That was a really interesting time. It was like right around 2000, so kind of the dot-com bubble. That I don't think really affected us all that much because we weren't like a funded startup in Silicon Valley and all that. But it was good. It was a good place to, again, just over the years, I had just learned so much about technology, and then in college, with the internet and building websites, and that the other thing that came out of Virtuosities that's kind of interesting was we were putting up cameras on construction sites, to
Hmm.
monitor them and for marketing purposes. And that was at that moment in time, it was kind of a unique cross section of skills because it was like the security camera guys didn't really know much about the internet, and most web designers didn't want to be crawling around on top of 80-story buildings in Chicago. Unlike my wife, I have no fear of heights whatsoever. So I was on the roof of 80-story buildings in Chicago and and I'm
Wow.
also a photographer, so I have some really cool photos from that. Um, and that's really, Virtuosities ended up, folding, and that's how I launched Aztec. There was another brief company formed with a couple people in there somewhere. But then I started Aztec, and for the first 4 years, it was on my own, just because I had enough of the skills, for web design, and so I built it really slowly, very organically, deep uh, basis of relationships with people, and I guess I'm just naturally, good at that. I care, right? To the point of the podcast. It
100%.
was it was really the first lesson in, wow, if you just really show up and you care about the work and you care about the people and you take the time to listen and do good work, you will get rewarded for that, over
Hmm.
and over again. And that grew over time. And in parallel, you mentioned Go Human. That was a few years later. Really interesting startup. The idea there was kind of cross between Craigslist and Yelp, if you will, like bringing more accountability in small business advertising and reviews. Uh, Ultimately, it was a distraction from Aztec. One of the co-founders and I did not get along very well at all, and I specifically remember spending an entire day in an email battle with him.
Oh,
Just
no.
going back and forth where you're like quoting different parts of the email and like, no, you're wrong, and all this. And, I mean, I just vowed never again, and I don't blame him for that. We both gave as much as we got, in our horns locked, and that'll, I think, plant some seeds as to what I'm up to now around, conflict resolution. I ended up exiting. Oh gosh, I gave myself a
You gave
thumbs
yourself,
down on this one here.
yeah.
uh, and with Aztec, I mean, it was beautiful. I ended up growing it to a seven-figure company with 13 full-time employees, and I learned most things the hard way. And one of the things in the context of care was I learned how important it is to balance care. Obviously, self-care as a leader, I think a lot of leaders struggle with that.
Right.
But also the idea of how much care do I want to actually give to people versus how much can we actually afford to give to people. I know there was a moment early on when I overextended the benefits. I was like, well, gosh, we should have all these benefits. We should have a 401(k) and all these things. And we really couldn't afford it. So it ended up hurting the company and compromising our ability to do some more fundamental things. So,
Hmm.
one of my favorite quotes, from Prentice Hemphill is boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And
Great.
that says a lot about the core of care and love, and how we can balance, both of those. And then I guess the last one you had mentioned was the wise guy. That was connected to a fascinating project in 2016. This was after I had exited Aztec. I sold Aztec and went, really deep into purpose coaching and consulting. And so this idea of purpose came to me, and now my purpose is to unify humanity. And I connected with some folks here in Chicago who were writing a book called The Science of Story, and we ended up interviewing 500 leaders about their purpose. And it was after Simon Sinek's big talk, so that was a big part of the motivation. Start with why.
Mm.
And we loved interviewing folks just like you do, and we'd sit there for an hour, and then we challenged ourselves to kind of come up with a why for them and say, the very short version of a why, like 3 to 4 words. And sometimes we nailed it. Sometimes it was just kind of an interesting conversation. And uh, but alongside that was a show that I created called The Wise Guy, and I ended up recording about 30 episodes of that, and just really exploring this conversation. What makes people tick? Like what gets them out of bed in the morning? Why do they do what they do? Why, what is the moment of joy that just lifts them up more than any
Right.
other?
It's interesting because one definition or one not definition, one method or whatnot they would call it, it would be, would you do it for nothing,
Hmm.
whatever you're doing? And it's a great question because I would envision that the majority of people wouldn't do it for nothing, whatever they're doing, because you really got to love what you're doing to do that. But the why became a big deal, and it's still a big deal, I think, because if you don't have it, you're probably going to get burnt out, or something's going to happen. It's not going to work. Tell me a little bit then. You started moving on to leading from love, basically. Consulting. To a focus on that, to a focus on, and even gathering change agents, to even quote gathering change agents to now. Did that like purposely lead to co-founding Feel Real, or I guess there was some connection, but it seems, and one why I love asking about what we were like as a kid or whatnot, there always seems to be some kind of thread that goes along, and it might turn a little bit, but the core seems to be there, and um, either gets expanded positively by influencers around, or kind of stays but doesn't grow. It seems yours grew clearly of combining tech and humanity, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Hopefully you get to a point in your life and you can look back and see the thread more clearly. It's
Right.
probably always there, but when we're in it, it's harder to see. And at a couple of these major junctures, I've gone back to LinkedIn and rewritten my summary. And that's been a good opportunity to sort of take stock and look back at that thread. Um, so yeah, lead from love. I mentioned I went into purpose coaching and consulting. I did a lot of training with the True Purpose Institute that was founded by Tim Kelly. It's an incredible body of work. We could define it as a sort of psycho-spiritual practice. And there's really two main pieces of it. One is the psychological work, and a lot of that has to do with parts work, right? Like understanding the different parts of your psychology, the different voices and aspects of yourself, the protective parts, the inner child, like what were some early childhood wounds perhaps that
Right.
led to behaviors and programming that maybe aren't serving us so well, and more or less a Jungian foundation. But and thankfully, I don't know. I swim in these circles, so it's a little hard to judge how common some of this stuff is. But I do feel like it's becoming more and more common. Like more and more people are talking about it. Therapy is less of a stigma than it did before.
Yeah.
So that gives me hope. And the other part of it is the spiritual aspect, and the basic premise is, if we're tangled up in a lot of the wounding and the psychological aspect, or we're overprotective, or we're projecting, or we're having dysfunctional relationships, that degrades our relationship with the spiritual. And that can or cannot be religious as far as I'm concerned. In that body of work, it was about having a direct connection with a higher power, and you get to decide. You get to name that, you get to decide what that is and how that is for you. But you can actually have a conversation that leads to making decisions that are more intuitive and rooted in love. And so for me, I downloaded a lot of information about love in my own journey, connecting with higher source, and and then I named the practice Lead from Love. And I did that for a few years and worked with a lot of leaders. I worked with one manufacturing company. I mean, it's incredible. I'm sitting there, at a manufacturing company outside of Chicago, leading ten of the top leaders through a guided meditation to ask their spiritual guidance what the purpose of the company is. Like
Hmm.
that was a really powerful moment for me. Um, and alongside that, the Gathering for Change Agents evolved out of the True Purpose Institute like 12 years ago, really ahead of its time for like an online convening place. And in the early days, that was sort of phone teleconference. I mean, now we do it on Zoom. I've been a co-host for about the last 6 years, and I still am. Every month we gather, we invite in a guest to share their wisdom with us, and then we have dialogue around it. It's a really beautiful space.
Yeah.
Uh, Curious about that, go to gatheringforchange.com. And then along the way, so if you mix all of that, you put that all in the soup, along the way, one piece I left out was in 2007, I saw a vision in a dream. And the best way I can describe this is seeing the globe as a sphere and just all these connected bonds of light. And now I believe that is life itself. I believe we're all connected. It's consciousness, it's love. It's what brings us together. And as I said, my purpose that I discovered through all that work was to unify humanity. And it's possible. Another way to say that would be like we're already unified. I mean, at the soul level, I think we're already unified. So it's a question of like, well, what's getting in the way of that unification? How much other stuff have we piled on? Fear and judgment and disconnection and greed and whatever. And so that's a lot of what the work is. And of course, I'm human too. So my work never stops and I'm always on the journey. So that eventually led to launching Feel Real in 2019. And, Feel Real was the culmination of all of that. And the idea there was how can we convene and develop really deep connections with each other online? 2019, pre-pandemic, that wasn't that common. I mean, the Gathering for Change Agents, I think, was ahead of its time. And there were certainly some other, communities that were the gathering online. Uh, and I was never against the idea of gathering in person, but of course, there's some huge advantages to gathering online in terms of accessibility and
Sure.
convenience, and who gets to participate in reaching across the world. I mean, maybe like you, I know people.
People you may have never meet without it.
Oh my gosh, I mean, yeah, like regularly talk with people across the world. I have deep relationships with people I have literally never met in person. And
Ditto.
and it's always amazing to meet those people in person when you finally get to. Uh, and so Feel Real ended up hosting about 300 dialogues during the pandemic. And we gathered a network of about 900 space holders, as we call them, the people who are uniquely sort of, gifted. There's probably some natural gifts, but they're also tend to have training in facilitation and emotional intelligence and often a social justice orientation and various other skills that feed into that. And
Hmm.
then over the years, Feel Real became an incubator for other projects. We launched a project last year where my good friend walked from Chicago to Montgomery, Alabama for social justice. We launched a project called Heal Together Coalition. We're bringing together Arab and Jewish folks to talk about what was happening in Palestine and Israel.
Yeah.
And then that's also led to the current main focus for me, which is CoGo, and that's a project I founded with my wife, and I can talk more about that.
Um, the I think kind of a couple of things you said there that reminded me of a video I got once where I think you said it didn't matter what you call it, spiritual, religious, whatever. I got a video sent to me once that on in the middle was everything from God and Allah to prophet to son to Mishkabibble to whatever in the middle. And on this side, there was arguing about what do you call it. On the other side, they were arguing about changing their names to Mahatma Rainbow or something. And the whole purpose of it, it doesn't matter what you call it, just be it and be it in together and stop wasting time because it doesn't matter what it's called. And I think that holds us back a lot in so many ways about categorizing and judging and whatnot on everything from capitalism to socialism to a title to whatever, rather than achieving and doing and getting the real why that you're talking about, rather than well, it's not we don't agree with anything on this side or we don't agree with anything on that side. All the stuff that we go into. So I think that's brilliant how you described it. And I wanted to ask you what you're envisioning then with respect to AI being fast and furious, going back to the 80s when you were playing with it. Now it's zooming fast and furious, and there's a lot of conversation about massive layoffs, which there will be more and more. But is it an opportunity? Because I've had a lot of conversations about AI and love intelligence and AI and ethics and every technology can have good and bad, or it's what the people do with it. Um, but do you envision and is there a possibility that AI could actually, depending on how business leaders play with it, um, be the technology finally that allows more people to be happy? And what I mean by that is, um, if there's going to be all these layoffs, what would happen if the companies um, don't just take all the extra money they make from the layoffs and put it to where some of the people they were going to lay off do stuff in community because it's economically viable for them to do that, so all those people don't go on unemployment, but they do good things in the community, which helps their brand, but also avoids higher taxes because what are you going to do if everybody's on unemployment and bad healthcare and all that stuff? How do you see the how do you envision what's going to happen in the future with AI having a big impact?
Yeah, I mean, I am an optimist, for better or worse, and I'm going to say better, and I also, I watch Black Mirror, and I've watched almost every branch of sci-fi you can imagine about artificial consciousness, and I've seen every, doomsday scenario, uh, and I actually think it's useful. I say, a lot of folks I meet are like, I don't want to watch Black Mirror. Life's hard enough. I'm like, yeah, but what? Why don't we watch it on TV, and then maybe we'll be less likely to create it in real life, So yeah, AI ethics very important to me. Um, I truly believe. I mean, this technology is revolutionary, and that's been said about a lot of technologies.
Hmm.
One technology in particular, very broad set of technologies, social media. I got very excited about. I mean, that was a big part of what Aztec was doing was social media consulting, and I just so believe in, my guiding lights are dignity and agency. So, anything that can empower folks to have more voice and have more, agency in the world, to me is extraordinary. And then look what happened. I mean, social media kind of got consumed by big tech interests and big ad networks, and most of us know kind of how that went and how we became the product over the years. And so I think we have this opportunity right now with AI. Now it's obviously still, I would argue we needed big tech and maybe big government to do it to begin with because it's hundreds of billions of dollars, worth of investment. And I'm encouraged because there are so many models emerging. Like there's more efficient, smaller models, and the pace is dizzying to your point. I mean, it's just like nothing we've ever seen. So I truly hope that this could lead to an absolute transformation of our society. The way we think about work, the way we think about the
Right.
value of our time is really like rooted in the early part of the Industrial Revolution and kind of what happened in the mid 20th century. And it just seems very out of date. Many of us are gig workers one way or another,
Hmm.
taking little pieces of things here and there. The pandemic, as far as I understand, was one of the greatest wealth transfers we've ever seen. And so, the rich are getting richer, and that's the biggest concern because AI is driven by big tech, is that could keep happening. But my hope would be that, look, I don't really love nation states, because they're sort of these artificial boundaries of people. And at the same time, I love having distinct cultures, right? So
Hmm.
it's just that a lot of times, especially if there's a war, we're sort of trained to imagine these divides. It's like politics, there's sort of this training to say, well, that side's the enemy and this side's the right one.
Right.
And I think a lot of that's just basically, falsified. And so this power of AI to, to bring forth a new economic way of being, call it, you know, a minimum, uh, I don't know, it has to go pretty far beyond the idea of, like a minimum payment for every person, right? It's like, oh, here's $1,000 a month or whatever. Thinking far beyond that is how do we even measure what is valuable? Like, what if our economy was based on wow, how many people did you connect with today? How many people did you help out today? How many acts of kindness did you have today? And I'm not suggesting we have technology that has to measure all those things because that's not
Oh,
exactly the
if
answer.
I can interrupt for a sec, there's been schools that are the kindness schools that their whole curriculum was, I haven't spoken to them in a while, but their whole curriculum was kind acts, nothing else.
Yeah.
The kids would go out and put little notes in library books. They'd help somebody across the street. They'd clean up a park. They'd whatever. And what ended up happening was they'd come back and say, well, let's count how many we talked to. And it started a statistics course. Or they come back to with the gardens and saying, well, what were they growing and why and what happened? They were creating another curriculum and they were thrilled about being in school, starting with reason, actual reason of what they kind stuff they were doing that was good for the community, then became good for a curriculum, and then that would be good for education for other things. And I think to your point, the mindset has to change a little bit about what is important to us, and maybe it starts with the community, and you have to have economic impact to be viable, but it starts with maybe the why is the community, and as a business, we're part of the community, which goes well beyond CSR. It goes with getting engaged in the community way more, and hopefully AI can do that, giving us more time to be able to commit to being in the community and being together and doing good things. And we just have to get over things like ego and greed and other things like that that are kind of in the way sometimes.
I agree. I think it's already the case that AI makes a lot of professions more efficient. We're not, yeah, it's going to replace a lot of things. That's true. We're not quite there yet. It's interesting the companies that have gone
Mm.
all in on replacing people are like, oh, it's a little early. They're kind of pulling back and be like, so we're a lot of folks figuring out, but look at even pre-AI for several years. I mean, as a part of, you know, conscious business, just looking at employee engagement, for instance,
Mhm.
as a metric in the US, I mean, for years, it's been maybe 60% disengagement. Well, just do the math. I mean, that means people are really only doing 2 days worth of work every week. And what are they doing the rest of the time? They're pretending to work, right? Or it's so inefficient, right? So there's a major
And they're not happy
gap
when
here.
they're not
Yeah,
happy when they're doing that because it's not happiness doing that. Uh,
right.
But maybe if they were, and it's a longer topic, but maybe if they were people that would have been laid off, um, paid to do work in the community, paid to do gardens in every school across the country and teach about that and everything or whatever. It's a big mindset shift, but I think it's economically and probably socially productive.
And I agree. And maybe there's even a post-money world we need to envision, right? Where
Yeah,
there's a different currency or there's no currency or and that this level of automation across the board could make that possible, right? So the thing my wife
100%.
and I are focusing on, CoGo, it is an AI company. It's an AI product we're building right now, and our focus is on how can AI help us develop more meaningful relationships with each other, particularly helping us, at least as a starting point, to navigate conflict and realizing I know this is something that we've chatted about a bit
Hmm.
and we in the context of conflict and other areas, but uh, you know that to me is one of the places we get the most tangled up, right? I was talking about that co-founder I got tangled up with years and years and years ago.
Happens all the time between co-founders.
Between co-founder, I think the more intimacy there is really, and the more surface area, the more potential for conflict. And I love, non-flict's definition. I'll sort of shorten or paraphrase. It's just encountering difference, right? So this idea, it's not about getting rid of conflict. It's about
You don't
actually
want to get rid of
embracing,
conflict.
yeah, embracing the difference, moving through it constructively, and ideally using the fact that there was difference and there was tension, there was energy there to build something new together.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the whole ball game, and I think you're onto something there where it may not even be a money or currency thing, and that's where we can be happier. We don't need to do that. It's all about living the way we would want to live, happy, and you don't need a 52 room mansion to be happy. maybe a three-bedroom house, and everybody has one. And it's not true. It's not Truman as the movie, or it's not socialism. It's just getting to a point where it's not about money. It's about having a happy life, a healthy life, etc. And it sounds fuzzy to people sometimes, but if ever we're moving in that direction, and there's the possibility for that, I think AI can do that. Like you're saying, taking over all sorts of stuff that we don't have to do. God, I remember as a CPA having to scotch tape 14 column papers to do consolidations of companies on a boardroom, and we're taping all the papers together. We didn't even have the computers to do that yet, for God's sakes.
Wow.
So there's a lot there. But the last question I want to ask on this, and because in LA we say leave them wanting more, so we can do a sequel. So maybe we'll have to go there. But we talked about the pandemic, and one of my clients called it the year that flew by slowly, which I thought was kind of cool as a term. And but with all that, now we're already in 2025, the last half of 2025. Can you share with us what you're most grateful for, and also what you're most hopeful for?
Yeah. Well, I am most grateful for my family, as I mentioned, just being married for just a little bit less than 2 years, and especially since, as I said, my wife is also my co-founder, so deeply grateful that we do so much together. We're building together, and we're building this technology for ourselves first and foremost, right? And that's part of what gives me hope, that AI truly has the power to help each of us heal, see truth more clearly, and as we've talked about, create more economic opportunities and emotional stability for everyone.
That's awesome. Well said. Well, I'm grateful that I have a new friend. That's cool, and who is a leader who cares. That's clear. And I'm kind of hopeful for him the same thing. And I'm glad you have a bonus daughter, right? A bonus daughter
Yep.
rather than a stepdaughter as well. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for giving us your insights and all that, and for being a leader who cares. And appreciate you being on.
Thanks, Mark.